And I appreciate everybody coming on board. Um, my name is Stephen Lauer. I'm a recent graduate of Kansas State University, focused on sociology, and I'll be talking about the research that I've been doing over the past 4 years having to do with the social implications of groundwater management in the High Plains. So just a quick overview of the presentation. I'm going to talk about, well, first I'll give an overview, and then I'll talk about structure, and then culture, then agency and interactions, and I'll close with a summary. So all the research is focused on one problem, and that's the social implications of the declining groundwater in the Ogallala Aquifer. As sociologists, we look at society in terms of the interactions between 3 different things. So we have social structure, which is enduring patterns of relationships between groups of people. So an example of social structure would be the relationships, say, between producers and marketers, or relationships between business owners and regulators, that type of thing. Culture has to do with what people believe is important and how people believe we ought to live. So that has to do with values, beliefs, norms, general practices. And then agency is our ability as individuals and as groups to make meaningful decisions. And so again, sociology, we look at these 3 aspects of society and we look at how they interact. So my research is modular, and I examine this one problem, like I said, from multiple angles. And each module of the research shows a different aspect of how producers' groundwater management of the Ogallala Aquifer intersects with a different set of social theories. So the first research question that I'll be exploring is, does groundwater extraction improve county-level human development in the region? The focus here is on social structure. And I look at 3 theories, the community capitals approach, the Human Development Index, and the treadmill of production. And I'll explain a little bit more about each of these as I move into the actual body of the presentation. The data, it's secondary data. So that just means that it's data that, in this case, the federal government has collected and that then I analyze. And I use a path analysis model, which is a statistical model that enables us to look at correlations between, in this case, groundwater extraction and different measures of human development in the region. The second broad research question is, what are the values and motivations underlying producers' groundwater management decisions in the region? And here the focus is on culture, which again is values, beliefs, norms, worldviews, that type of thing. I use primary survey data for this. This is a survey of producers in the region. And I use both descriptive statistics and a path analysis in this analysis. Finally, I ask, how are some Western Kansas producers able to sustain voluntary group action to manage these groundwater challenges? And so the focus here is on agency and on interactions between structure, culture, and agency. I look at 3 different theories, and again, I'll go into a little bit more detail about the approach when I get to the relevant section. There's grounded theory, there's a theory of public narrative by Marshall Gans, and then there's a 3-stage model of empowerment as well that I look at. The data here are also primary data, but the focus is on interviews that I've done with producers, observations of different meetings, particularly in Kansas Groundwater Management District 1, and then also content analysis, which involves reading through meeting minutes and other documents to look at what people are talking about and how people made the decisions they made. And this is what we would call a qualitative case study. So focused not so much on numbers, but more on content. Just a quick overview of the primary data collection. So I did a survey of producers. We had 1,200 respondents, and the goal was to understand the prevalence of various attitudes towards groundwater management in the region. The survey was sent between January and June of 2018, and we did achieve a representative sample of producers in the region. And so if you look at the top picture there, we did sample from the whole region. And as far as the state of Kansas is concerned, we looked at all the counties that are at least partially underlain by the Ogallala Aquifer Formation. The interviews with producers focused just on the western third of Kansas. This is groundwater management districts 1, 3, and 4. And this is the part of the state that's managed on a planned depletion basis. So it made sense to not look so much at south central Kansas, which has different hydrology and is the goal there for management is on sustainable yield. The goal here was to understand the full diversity of attitudes towards groundwater management. So I conducted 41 interviews with Kansas producers between March of 2017 and February of 2019, focused on a diversity of farm sizes and types. And whereas the survey can give us representative statistics, the interviews are more about, again, understanding diversity of opinions and approaches. And then I also did a case study of the Wichita County water conservation area. And you could see I've highlighted Wichita County in that blue square. The goal here was to understand how voluntary group conservation works. And again, this was looking at interviews with those involved, document analysis, watching meetings from March 2018 through the present. And the focus was on really understanding group dynamics. How does water conservation actually happen on the ground? And then also to develop recommendations for producers in other areas who might want to do something similar. So again, the first research question is just asking, does groundwater extraction improve county level human development? The focus on structure. The key findings here is natural capital in the form of groundwater is being depleted without effective reinvestment into local human and financial capitals, and that's human development. And so this may be due to what's called a treadmill of production, which involves just producers having to increasingly invest in more and more extraction to just kind of stay in place. It could also be due to local reinvestments into social and cultural values. And so it could be that, and there's some evidence that producers at the county level anyway, are investing groundwater extraction in being able to sustain higher populations and being able to sustain an agricultural lifestyle, way of life. And so those investments would not show up in terms of income, education metrics, and so on. Looking at culture, again, the question is, what are the values and motivations underlying producers' groundwater management decisions? Find that producers support groundwater conservation. Regionally, that's 9 out of 10, and no state had fewer than 80% of producers saying that Ogallala groundwater should be saved or conserved. The primary motivations for conservation are for the local community and for future generations. Most producers believe they're already doing all that they can individually to conserve on their operations. Voluntary group efforts have opportunity to grow. And cultural differences don't explain which producers are civically engaged in groundwater management at the group level. So we made that model of values, beliefs, and norms, and those differences in those don't actually predict which producers are working to conserve groundwater as groups. The third question, looking at how some Western Kansas producers are able to sustain voluntary group action. Found that civic engagement is contingent. And so producers' agency, their ability to make meaningful decisions, that interacts with both structure and culture. Producers in Wichita County were able to sustain their civic engagement by cultivating group solidarity and a sense of meaning through public narrative. I identified 5 keys to success that were present in the Wichita County group, but also in another voluntary group action in a different part of Kansas. And those have to do with diverse stakeholder representation, an early focus on team building, having an effective outside facilitator, effective outreach to the community, and partnering with state and local government. So for each audience, I've just chosen to highlight a few implications at the beginning of this presentation. And again, I'll try to flesh these out more in the body of the presentation. For producers, one implication, voluntary group efforts require a lot of work, but they can be effective at conserving groundwater. Producers should be aware of the challenges of balancing competing values and addressing emotions of fear, grief, and discouragement when engaging in these voluntary group efforts. Consider a public narrative approach to social change and learn from previous efforts such as the Wichita County Water Conservation Area and also the Sheridan 6 Lima in Northwest Kansas. Policymakers. There's a political mandate to take actions that encourage groundwater conservation. And there's also room to experiment with a range of conservation strategies. That second recommendation comes out of our finding that different levels of groundwater extraction are not at the county level tied to aggregate income or education or health metrics. So that suggests again that there's some room for experimentation here without an immediate harm to the community. Policymakers should more explicitly determine what it is that people wish to conserve. And my research suggests that the primary thing folks wish to conserve are communities. So that also involves considering what influence and what responsibilities non-farming residents should have in these decisions. You know, a lot of times, at least in Kansas, irrigated land brings in a lot higher tax revenue. And that's certainly something that needs to be considered when talking about conservation. You know, what role should non-farming residents have in helping make decisions, but then also what responsibilities should come with that role in terms of sharing and sacrifices. Voluntary group efforts are effective at conserving groundwater and merit support. And particularly policymakers have an opportunity to help producers overcome barriers to engagement by making participation less time intensive and by providing facilitation. And again, that goes back to that sort of key to success that we found in terms of outside facilitation. Academics, further developing theoretical linkages between community capital's framework and the treadmill of production. And again, I'll get into this a little bit more in the next section. Additional surveys and interviews could help us better understand how the role of culture in shaping producers' decisions differs across time and space. So the interviews, again, that I did were really focused on just that western third of Kansas. And I think there's a real opportunity for similar research to be conducted in other states, potentially in that south central part of Kansas that is different hydrologically. And then, of course, surveys, you know, a survey that could be done a few years from now would also be very interesting, especially if it were to coincide with a period of drought. So our survey coincided with a wet period climatically, and I think it would be really interesting to see how producers' decisions might differ or might not differ based on wet and dry periods. And then also a comparative case study approach could bring additional insight into these interactions and how civic engagement among producers actually plays out. So my case study was really focused on Wichita County in Kansas with some supplementation from efforts in other parts of the state. You know, identifying potentially a voluntary group effort in, say, Nebraska or Texas with very different legal frameworks, I think would be a fascinating academic objective. So now I'm going to focus on social structure. Again, just briefly, the question is, does groundwater extraction improve county-level human development in the Ogallala Aquifer region? So we looked at community capitals, human development index, and treadmill of production here, using secondary data and a path analysis model. And it is based on published research. So our variables, measures of well-being, were the human development index. And so the human development index is a weighted measure. A third of it is life expectancy at birth. So that's a general measure of health that's available through the census. 1/3 is education, and this looks both at high school graduation rates and at school enrollment as a percentage of folks who are school aged. And then also looking at income per capita. And so how this intersects with the community capitals framework I've been talking about is health and education are both what would be considered human capital, and income is a measure of local financial capital. So we're basically looking at, you know, are people healthy and well educated and making good incomes at the county level? Looked at two measures of groundwater use: the percentage of agricultural land in a county that's under irrigation, and also the quantity of groundwater used for irrigation. Controlling for population and state. And the data were from, like I said, the US Census, USDA Census of Agriculture, and the US Geological Survey. So the key finding here is groundwater use is actually not correlated with county-level Human Development Index scores. And so this suggests that natural capital in the form of groundwater is being depleted without effective reinvestment into local human and financial capitals. I've got a model here. I'm going to kind of blow through this, but there's a good model fit. Folks who are interested in statistical modeling will probably recognize this. And so here's the path model. And what we've got here, if you look at the middle with the HDI 1980, HDI 1990, etc. So this is Human Development Index calculated based on the census of 1980, 90, 2000, and 2010. On the top, we've got the impact of groundwater use, basically for irrigation. And so we've got the irrigated farmland and the groundwater extraction from the Census of Agriculture that was taken closest to the, closest but prior to the measure of Human Development Index. Then on the bottom, we've got controls. So looking at county population and looking at state down there. And so I've highlighted here in the sort of orange color the impacts of groundwater extraction on Human Development Index. And if you look, there's basically no effect. I mean, -0, so that's not even significant. -0.1 is significant, but really small enough that I don't consider that to be meaningful in any way. So basically, after controlling for population and state, we find that counties with more groundwater extraction over this time period from 1980 to 2010 really don't differ in terms of their human development. Similarly for irrigated farmland. And here again, we see very small numbers, and actually none of these are significant. There's no asterisks anywhere. We do see differences emerge over time among states. Just the quick summary here is that in 1980, Kansas had a higher Human Development Index than pretty much everybody. But by 2010, the differences mainly disappear, except that Nebraska actually has, in 2010, a slightly higher Human Development Index. So this would be, I would imagine, be interesting to policymakers looking at comparative effects of different policies. But of course, keeping in mind that income, education, and health are influenced by much more at the state level than simply groundwater extraction, right? There's a lot of different policies that can potentially have impacts there. So turning to possible explanations. One possibility is unequal exchange. And the idea here is that the groundwater, right, there's value in groundwater. That's what we mean by natural capital. And it could be that this groundwater is effectively being reinvested outside the region. So it could potentially be, the value might be moving to Chicago or Kansas City, to urban centers. And then we wouldn't see an impact on incomes in the region if that were the case. Another possibility is a treadmill of production, where the natural capital is being reinvested primarily into irrigation infrastructure, which as built capital, I mean, again, we know that infrastructure has a value, but it wouldn't be expected to impact education, health, or income at the county level, right? That's the treadmill of production basically involves moving faster and faster in terms of groundwater extraction without actually attaining large local benefits. And then, the other explanation, and these explanations are not mutually exclusive. They could all be going on at the same time, and I've actually found some evidence for each of them. Could be local reinvestment into other capitals. So this value that's in groundwater, there's some evidence that it's being reinvested into cultural and social capital as opposed to financial and human capital. So again, cultural capital would have to do with the value of an agricultural lifestyle. Social capital has to do with the value of cohesive rural communities. So my interviews do provide evidence for a treadmill of production and for local investment in other capitals. As far as implications go, suggests that local policymakers have a window of time to experiment with conservation policies before groundwater runs out. Right, so if we were to find a really strong relationship between groundwater extraction and income and health and education, it would suggest that, you know, reductions of groundwater use are really going to have a pretty immediate impact on constituents, and that's not the case. You know, social capitals, cultural capitals, right? Those are things that change a bit more slowly than, say, family incomes or life expectancies. So there's wide latitude for policy experimentation. On the other hand, researchers have an opportunity to further explore synergies between these different frameworks. This is something that has been understudied in the social sciences. So now I'm going to move on to culture. And again, the main question here is well, there's two. What is the distribution of values, beliefs, and norms held by High Plains producers? Also, do differences in values, beliefs, or norms explain producer involvement in collaborative groundwater management? And there's actually a social science framework called the Values, Beliefs, Norms Framework, and that's what we use. It's very well supported in the literature. The data is primary data. It's the survey of producers I spoke about earlier. For the purposes of this presentation, I've also supplemented that with quotes from the producer interviews. Methods are descriptive statistics to answer the first question about distributions, and a path analysis to answer the second question about explanations for producer involvement. This is also based in part on published work that is available. Key findings as far as descriptive statistics go. Producers overwhelmingly support groundwater conservation. Groundwater depletion is primarily a community problem. The primary motivation to conserve is supporting the local community and future generations. Most producers believe that they're already doing all they can individually to conserve on their operations. With support, voluntary group conservation efforts have opportunity to grow. So, simply asking, should Ogallala groundwater be saved or conserved? We see 9 out of 10 producers say yes, and only 10% then say no. Breaking it down by state, we see overall, again, it's 9 out of 10. There's no state that has fewer than 8 out of 10 producers saying that groundwater should be saved or conserved. We see that the responses in Nebraska and Colorado are in the kind of low 80s saying should be saved or conserved. Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, all at or above 90%. And then Texas is 84% or so. A producer in Northwest Kansas says, I think about water all the time. We're all doing our part to keep our families and traditions afloat, to maintain what we have and to pass it on. So we're also curious, whose problem is groundwater depletion, right? And overall, we asked, is it a personal problem? Groundwater levels are a problem for my farm, family, or household. Is it a community problem? And then that last column there to the right looks at the gap, the perception, how much greater is the perception of a community problem than a personal problem? And the first row there looks overall. And I should mention that the overall numbers are highly impacted by Nebraska, simply because of the large number of producers as a percentage of the overall region who live in Nebraska. So we see overall about 4 out of 10 believe it's a personal problem, and almost half agree it's a community problem, which is an 8% difference. Nebraska is a bit lower, where we've got 23% as a personal, 29% as a community. But then looking at the other states, Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, all perceiving more than half as a personal problem. Kansas is about a third, and Oklahoma is almost half. And then those other states, everybody sees, well, a majority, I should say, in every state, so 55% in Oklahoma see it as a community problem, all the way through 80% in Texas. Looking at the difference in Colorado through Texas, we see 11%, 24%, 8%, 15%, 9%. So we're seeing a big gap in perception where more producers say it's a community problem than a personal problem. And that I should mention that is even true in Nebraska. We just see fewer folks saying it's a problem in Nebraska. Hydrologically, they have a lot more water, so that may explain why. Motivations for conservation. So we asked, should groundwater be saved or conserved to secure a way of life for future generations? This is overall, looking at the region overall, 86% agree, 12% are neutral, and only 2% disagree. Supporting local communities, we've got 2/3 agreeing, a little over a quarter are neutral on that one, and only 6% disagree. Preparing for droughts, 63% agree, about a quarter again are neutral, and 11% disagree. Profitability of irrigated farms, again, we've got 6 out of 10 agreeing, almost a third being neutral here, and then 11% disagreeing again. So we asked about other motivations, but these are the main motivations that we found for producers saying that groundwater should be saved or conserved. So a producer in West Central Kansas, I used to think that the water was mine and I could do with it as I pleased. And I still think the water under my land is mine, but I also believe in a greater sense that it's ours and we need to conserve it. And I think it would be extremely selfish for us to use that water up and not save it for future generations. We also see limited capacity for more individual conservation. We asked producers to agree or disagree with the statement, I already limit my groundwater use as much as possible. And almost 3 out of 4 say that that's true on their operation. Only 7% disagree, that they think they could do more personally. And now this may or may not be true in terms of management practices, technology, and different things, but I think the perception is obviously very important in impacting behavior, right? The idea that yes, groundwater should be conserved, but I'm really already doing all I can. As far as barriers to individual conservation, some of the less common barriers are about taking too much effort, environmental regulations being too strict, not knowing what options exist. More common, water use regulations are not strict enough. Almost half of the producers said that was a barrier. If they don't pump the water, someone else will. People being self-interested or greedy, or requiring more expensive technology. And then the most common, not wanting to change irrigation practices and the perception that saving groundwater would decrease production. Voluntary group efforts have opportunity to grow. We actually see that 84% of producers are open to the possibility that voluntary group efforts can solve problems. Same percentage believe they personally might have something worthwhile to contribute to these efforts. But only 7% are currently involved in organizing voluntary group efforts. And so we see this as an opportunity, again, seeing how individual conservation, the perception is that it's really played out, right? Folks believe they're doing all they can. They seem to have a great deal of openness to the possibility of voluntary group efforts, but again, we've got very few folks who are actually involved in organizing these. Why aren't more involved? Well, the main reason is that lots of time and effort is required to organize these. So we asked why you don't get more involved in groups that are conserving water. The responses that aren't so common, again, arguing that they aren't effective or that producers don't have anything worthwhile to contribute. Preferring to focus on other issues and traveling to group meetings, both of those are about a quarter. And then not being enough time in the day, that's 30%. Needing to prioritize success of the farm, avoiding making too many commitments, and prioritizing spending time with family are the most common. Those that are circled in blue all have to do with the amount of time and effort that are involved in voluntary group conservation efforts. So that's a quick overview of the descriptive statistics, and now I'll move into the model. And the question that we asked here, basically, we're looking at different values. Values are things that people believe are important to them. Beliefs, and we looked at the new ecological paradigm is a worldview that basically argues that humans are part of nature and should work with nature, as opposed to the old ecological paradigm being that humans are outside of nature and have dominion over it. The norms we looked at, again, should I conserve groundwater for future generations, local jobs, local farm profitability? And our outcome was, is the producer engaged in voluntary group conservation efforts, yes or no? Controlled for other variables that could reasonably be expected to have an influence on our outcome. And this is based on previous studies. I'm kind of blowing through this pretty quickly, but a lot of this, I think, is more of interest to sociologists than to a general audience. Our key findings: cultural variation is not the primary explanation for which producers are civically engaged in voluntary group conservation efforts. Among irrigators, agreement with the norm to conserve groundwater for future generations is positively associated, but the association is very small in magnitude. Again, we've got good model fit. We ran separate models for irrigators and for dryland producers. That was some feedback that we'd gotten at a previous Ogallala meeting, was that people wanted to see irrigators and dryland producers separately. So this is our path model for irrigators. And really what to focus on, if you look at the very bottom, is civic engagement. And feeding into that are those norms. And then as you move up a level, we've got new ecological paradigm there sort of in the middle left, our control variables in the upper left, and our values in the upper right. And again, our only significant predictor of who's civically engaged in terms of norms is the idea that, or folks supporting the norm that water should be conserved for future generations. No significant associations between local farm profit or local jobs as motivations to conserve. Dryland, actually none of these are significant predictors of which dryland producers are civically engaged in groundwater conservation efforts as a group. So from the path model, we see that differences in values, beliefs, and norms don't explain which producers are civically engaged. And again, from the descriptive statistics, we just see that producers do overwhelmingly support conservation. They see it as primarily a community problem, and the main motivation to conserve is local community and future generations. Most believe they're doing all they can individually to conserve, but it looks like voluntary group conservation efforts are an opportunity to achieve further conservation. Implications: individually targeted initiatives appear to have reached saturation, and voluntary group efforts may provide further conservation gains. Policymakers have a political mandate to take actions that encourage groundwater conservation. We should more explicitly determine what people wish to conserve, and again, the survey suggests that the primary thing is communities. Given that we should be assuming we should be focused on communities, right, which this data does suggest, then we need to explicitly consider the influence and the responsibilities that non-farming residents should have. Also, additional surveys and interviews can help us better understand how the role of culture in shaping decisions varies over space and time. So now I'm going to turn to agency and interactions. This is the last prong of my research here. And the main question here is, how are some Western Kansas farmers able to sustain voluntary collective action to address groundwater management challenges, excuse me. Primary data being a case study of the Wichita County Water Conservation Area. Again, data collection involves interviews, observations, content analysis. So I've highlighted Wichita County and Kansas in red there. Home to approximately 2,100 residents in 2017, of which 2/3 are non-Hispanic white and almost 1/3 Hispanic. The median household income is below Kansas average. It's just over $55,000 a year. There's only one incorporated town, that's the town of Leota. Irrigated agriculture at feedlots drive the local economy. They're going to run out of water for irrigation in 25 years under a business as usual scenario. And here I've got some historical information about the cropping in Wichita County. In the upper left, we're looking at wheat acres harvested. The blue is all wheat acres, the gray being dry land, and the orange is irrigated. And so we see, you know, the irrigated acres picking up in 1955 and, you know, kind of going on a steady decline since 1980 or so. Looking at corn acres harvested. Now this is interesting just from a socioeconomic standpoint, because we really see that irrigated corn from 1955 really through 2002 was almost all the corn harvested. And it's only been in the past 10 or 15 years or so that we've seen dryland corn become a big part of producers' rotations. Milo acres, looking in the lower left. Irrigated milo picked up, but really has declined to almost nothing now. And so the overall milo acres harvested pretty closely track the dryland milo. And looking overall, we can see that irrigation in the lower right, irrigated grain acres, peaked around 1975 and have been on a pretty steady decline since then, which is correlated with the aquifer being depleted, actually. So looking at the interactions between structure and agency in Wichita County, again, social structure is enduring relationships between groups of people, and agency is the ability to make meaningful decisions. There are some structural incentives for conservation in Wichita County. Producers recognize the relationship between groundwater depletion and depopulation. Producers hope that a more gradual depletion will allow their local economies time to adjust. Some producers are actually running out of water for their houses, which makes conservation very, very urgent and very personal. There's also, of course, structural barriers to conservation. Irrigated land is more productive and it supports more jobs in the community. Producers did talk about a treadmill of production. Investment in irrigation infrastructure can take 10 or more years to pay off. And so once you've made that investment, you have a lot of difficulty in reducing your irrigation until it's paid off. Also concentration. So large producers have the biggest impact, but typically feel less urgency to conserve. And that's not universal, that's just a tendency. In Wichita County, the largest 5 families of irrigators control approximately 3/4 of the water. Absentee landlords were pointed as another barrier to conservation, especially those without connections to the local community. There's instances where they may demand that their renters continue pumping in order to maximize rents. Overall, structurally, Wichita County was predisposed towards voluntary group conservation because it has only one town, which is economically dependent on groundwater. There are some counties, well, the big example being Haskell County in Kansas, where there are 2 towns that are rivals, and it becomes more difficult then to work together as a larger community when there's large internal rivalries within the county. Also, Wichita County has about 25 years of groundwater left. So that's enough to make conservation urgent, but also for it to feel worthwhile. There are some producers I talked to in other parts of Kansas who felt that there was, they were within that sort of 10-year time horizon where it just didn't seem worthwhile to make the sacrifices, put in the effort when, they would maybe have 10 years instead of 5 years, right? But 25 years felt like enough to make conservation actually worthwhile. The idea that it could be stretched to allow the town time to adjust. Also, there was a previous conservation initiative that raised awareness among producers about the importance and some of the options for conserving groundwater in Wichita County. Looking at the intersections between culture and agency in Wichita County, cultural incentives include values of stewardship. Many producers feel accountable to God or to future generations for the legacy that they leave. Community. Producers value having towns and neighbors, and under the way the economy is currently, groundwater is necessary for both. Fairness. There are some producers who believe it's unfair to others in the area if they use all the water. And responsibility. Many producers feel an obligation to conserve groundwater for their heirs, whether that's sons or daughters or nephews or what have you. Cultural barriers, actually many of these same values can also be barriers. Community values, producers want to be on good terms with their neighbors and avoid controversy. And so valuing a community can also be a barrier to getting conservation initiatives rolling. Their fairness, this is probably the biggest cultural barrier out there once producers decide that they want to get together and try to conserve groundwater. There is no conservation plan that is perfectly fair to everyone. And, producers don't want others to gain an unfair advantage from their decisions to conserve groundwater. There's also responsibility in that producers value autonomy in making their own decisions about how to farm. Another barrier is fear. Irrigation provides a sense of security, and many producers are afraid of the uncertainty that new farming approaches bring. And then finally, grief. Irrigation is a part of the identity of many producers who may grieve over making changes. They're often the third or fourth generation of irrigators in their families, and it's an important part. Like I say, it's an important part of who they are, and there's a real sense of sacrifice in changing that. So there are no easy answers. This is a quote actually from a producer in Southwest Kansas who was involved with a conservation initiative that as of now hasn't quite worked out the way they'd hoped. But he says, we're trying to make it so that everybody takes an equal cut without being unfair to one side or the other. But on the other hand, everybody knows that the reason we're in this position is because people have pumped more water than is available. So it's an impossible situation. That's why we're moving forward slowly, because we don't know the right answer. And I don't think anybody can really tell us what is the right answer. So I just draw your attention to the first part of this quote. I'm trying to make sure everybody takes an equal cut without being unfair to one side or the other. And this producer has correctly identified that there is no one perfectly fair approach to take. So the Wichita County Water Conservation Area. Water conservation areas are voluntary legal contracts by irrigators to reduce their pumping. And the Wichita County WCA is actually the first in Kansas to allow county-wide participation. Started by a group of 10 local volunteers, they formed a planning team in 2016. Team members volunteered their personal time and also helped finance the effort with their own funds. So again, that looks, the personal time, there's a lot of time and effort involved in these. The plan was approved and opened for signups in 2017. Members commit to reducing pumping by at least 29% from their historic average use, and that does ratchet up over time. So far, the direct impact, 20% of irrigators in Wichita County are enrolled. They're conserving over 2,600 acre feet each year. The indirect impacts, there's increased awareness of groundwater conservation among producers in the county. There were several examples of producers I spoke with who were not enrolled in the water conservation area, but who were, one family made their own water conservation area. There were others who, a lot who are watching the Wichita County water conservation area to see if they can survive a drought before getting in. They've also influenced the creation of a local conservation plan that everyone would participate in. That's a different legal tool available to Kansas producers. Uh, it's called a LEMA, Local Enhanced Management Area, and there is one that's moving forward in Wichita County. And the Wichita County Water Conservation Area had a great deal of influence in making that happen. We're also seeing civic engagement spilling over to address other challenges their community faces. So the town of Leota is like a lot of towns in rural Kansas where they're facing a lot of different challenges. And members of the water conservation area have been involved in meeting some of those. One example would be converting a local church into a community space. There's examples working with youth in the schools, different things like that. So this graph looks at the water conservation plan, and you see the different curves here. And so these are curves based on different percentage of participation, because again, the water conservation area plan, each producer decides on his or her own whether they're going to enroll. And so with no change, we see that irrigation is no longer feasible around 2040. If you get 30% participation, you extend that by 7 years or so. 60% participation, now it runs into the mid-2050s. 90% participation is pushed out to 2068. So again, the WCA plan on its own is not going to enable the aquifer to last forever. But the main goal is to allow the community enough time that it can adjust and still be a community after irrigation is through. Keys to success include diverse stakeholder representation. So that includes producers who are young and old, small producers, large producers, dry land as well as irrigated, as well as feedlot and town interests. An early focus on team building. So, decisions about conserving groundwater are hard. They're emotionally hard. They're, there can be a lot of controversy and a lot of risk that people take in order to do that. And so the Wichita County Water Conservation Area put a lot of effort into team building early on so that they would have common goals and values that they could fall back on if the conversation got difficult. They brought in an outside facilitator. In their case, it was actually a minister from Salina, but who had grown up in Western Kansas. And the outside facilitator was able to help keep the conversations moving, also to identify potentially areas of stress or of conflict before they became a problem. Frequent and respectful community outreach is another big key to success. In the Wichita County Water Conservation Area's case, the team had multiple personal conversations, especially with the larger farm families, who again control between them about 3/4 of the water in the county. And then as the plan was nearing completion, they had a public outreach, and they actually made changes based on what their neighbors were saying and have continued to be engaged on groundwater issues in their community. Also partnering with state and local government. So in Kansas, that includes, of course, the chief engineer, the Kansas Water Office, the Department of Agriculture, Kansas Geological Service. Locally, that includes the Groundwater Management District, and various, I believe they worked with the school board and various others, first off, to make sure that there was a lot of buy-in to the plan, but also to identify problems and fix them early on. So civic engagement, common themes just in general for sustained civic engagement based on previous research include solidarity, people needing to feel a sense of membership and belonging, a sense of meaning and purpose, participants feeling their actions are meaningful to others and consistent with their personal integrity, and effective leadership. Leaders and followers co-create each other, and followers delegate primary responsibility for facilitating solidarity and meaning to their leaders. So Ganz's public narrative model of social change basically talks about the leadership practice of translating values into actions through stories. I'm kind of going to skip over Kiefer's stages of empowerment model because I actually didn't find clear evidence it was applicable. So solidarity, participants must feel a sense of membership and belonging to a group in order to stay engaged. So I had a Wichita County team member tell me, I think our success, a lot of it had to do with the relationships we built and the time we spent building a good foundation. It was a lot of relationship building. And I think sometimes our communities, whatever the project is, we forget we're all just people and we need to connect in that way. Their outside facilitator talked about, there'd be discouragement. There'd be times when the team needed a pep talk or needed to hear some good news of something. Oftentimes they would kind of do it on their own, but I also was intentional about at times either doing it or trying to ask some questions and looking at what are some of our successes so far. Sense of meaning and purpose. As we went around the room, there was a really strong consensus of everybody that they wanted to be good stewards, They wanted to be able to pass on this ability to irrigate and have a strong economy in the area to the future generations. And I think that's what helped us to meld as a group, even though we were diverse. We all melded together because we were all at one mind on what we wanted to try to accomplish. I think it was a God thing that the group that was put together was there. We're working on enrolling in the water conservation area because we believe it's the right thing to do. And there are some other people out there who have a similar thought process to us, that when you believe it's the right thing to do, you just do it because you believe it's the right thing. So those are both illustrative examples of the sense of meaning and purpose. Turning to the model of public narrative, basically arguing that values are experienced emotionally. They're sources of ends worthy of action, produce motivation for action. And so a successful public narrator articulates our challenge as a choice, reminds us of our moral resources through stories of family, community, culture, and faith, offers a hopeful vision we can share in as we take our first steps, and provides a specific immediate action that listeners can take. And so I apply this model to the Wichita County Water Conservation Area team. They used public narrative to manage their own emotions of fear, grief, and discouragement, to cultivate relationships of solidarity within the team, to establish that common sense of meaning and purpose, also to express their values to their community, and to facilitate action by others in their community. So this is one example of several, but I'm just going to give you the one for the moment. If someone else doesn't do it, like if I don't do it, who's going to? I want my kids to be able to live here if they want to. If they, raise their families, I want them to be able to raise their families here someday if they want to. I'm still invested because I want to know that my now 12-year-old can come back in 10 years and have a bright future here if she wants to. She wants to work with cattle, and she wants to be a vet, and she wants to come home and open her own clinic. And who am I to say to her, there's not going to be any water here. There's not going to be any people here. You shouldn't come back here. I can never say that to her. When she goes to college or whatever she does, and she says, Mom, I want to move back home, I want to be able to say, yep, we worked hard to save the water here so that we know we have a way of life we can sustain for years to come. They're saying their models can't predict way out into the future. But what if we turn that around and we don't even have to have models to predict way out into the future? It's never been done, but who says it can't be done? And there's no better group that could make this possible than the group that we pulled together. So we have to try. We don't have another choice. Every one of us loves living here in Wichita County and can't imagine living anywhere else. And if water is the reason we're here, we'd better keep the water here. Turning to key findings. Civic engagement is contingent, and we see agency interacting with structure and culture. Producers in Wichita County sustain civic engagement by cultivating group solidarity, building a shared sense of meaning and purpose, and successfully using public narrative. Keys to success included diverse stakeholder representation, early focus on team building, bringing in an outside facilitator, frequent and respectful community outreach, and partnering with state and local government. Some implications. Voluntary group efforts are effective at conserving groundwater and merit support. Policymakers can help producers overcome barriers to engagement by making participation less time intensive and by providing that outside facilitation. Organizers should be aware of the challenges of balancing competing values and of addressing emotions of fear, grief, and discouragement. Organizers should also consider taking a public narrative approach to social change and learning from previous efforts, including the Wichita County Water Conservation Area. As far as academics are concerned, I think a comparative case study approach would be very valuable here, potentially looking at other groups of producers who have also attempted voluntary group conservation efforts in other regions. So just overall, this is a repeat of my introduction here, but we're seeing that the groundwater is being depleted without being effectively reinvested into local human and financial capitals. Producers are supporting groundwater conservation, primarily for their communities. Most believe they're doing all they can individually, but there are opportunities for voluntary group efforts to potentially step in and pick up some of the remaining conservation that needs to be done. Civic engagement is contingent, and keys to success, I stated those previous slide. As far as producers are concerned, voluntary group efforts require a lot of work, but they can be effective. Be aware of these challenges and consider public narrative and learning from previous efforts. Policymakers recognize there is a political mandate to encourage groundwater conservation. There's some room to experiment, but it would be very helpful to explicitly determine what people wish to conserve and how influence and responsibilities should be equitably divided up within a community. And then academics, the big takeaway I would say is just there needs to be additional, particularly I would say interviews and case study approaches to really bring out some of the complexity in the region. So that's my presentation, and I think we do have some time for questions. We're running right up against our hour marker, so if people need to leave, that's of course absolutely fine as well. If you want to read more about my research, you can visit bit.ly/ksgroundwater, or as Amy mentioned at the beginning, there will be a recording available. So I'll open it up for questions now. Please don't forget to unmute yourself if you have a question.
Steve, this is Mark Rude. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Just a clarification question. How do I access the recording?
So I can't tell you absolutely for certain at this time. It will be, Amy will send that information out. It will be posted at ogallalawater.org. And I can also, Mark, for you, I can also email you personally. I have your email address. I'll make sure you get the link.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Bill, I see you're unmuted. Do you have something to say?
Yeah, I've got it. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so here is a question for you. I'm an economist, and we model water use, trying to find optimal time paths. And to find that optimal time path, we assume the objective function, or the most important aspect of it, is a monetary metric of producer net income or net profits. Mm-hmm. Given your findings, I'm sitting here saying maybe that shouldn't be the objective function. Maybe we should try to determine the optimal time path based on community well-being. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things I'd want to say about that. I think, in our democratic society, ultimately the question needs to be determined democratically, right? I think there is some evidence that producers are more concerned about, irrigation's impact on their communities than on their personal operations. You know, on the other hand, we know it's important, you know, not to force one group of people to bear disproportionate costs, right? So I think that that's certainly, the argument you made is certainly an argument that could be made, and that you know, I think the data from the survey supports to an extent. You know, but I would certainly defer to politicians to figure that out, right? I think the other thing, just to comment about net income, you know, the producers I talked to in the interviews, by and large, you know, they recognized the need to be profitable, right? But they weren't primarily talking in terms of maximizing their incomes. It was much more about how do I sustain this lifestyle in this rural area, you know, and be a valued member of my community, right? And you know, feed the world and things. How do I keep doing that? Knowing that I've got to make enough money, but not trying necessarily to make as much as I possibly can. So I think another approach to consider would be, you know, to what extent is profit maximization really even an objective among producers taken as a whole? And I can't answer that question. I can just provide, you know, evidence from my interviews, but I would certainly, you know, that's part of why academics, I would encourage more of these interviews, potentially, you know, more case studies to really determine, you know, is this a peculiarity of Kansas, or is it really very widespread?
Maybe building off that train of thought, another question is, have you seen research that's looked at in parts of the Midwest, let's say generally, where the communities are not as dependent on the agricultural production for their livelihood? How does that change the dynamic of, I know, for example, I've heard in talking to counties that have larger population base, they feel like they shift more of the blame, it seems, to the producers, and don't see how their community is interconnected as easily with agriculture. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I think looking at sort of a rural, you know, different rural communities, I think one of the big challenges that the High Plains face is that there really isn't a robust non-agricultural economy. You know, the folks who are up against the Rocky Mountains potentially have an amenities-based economy they can shift to. And there is some research looking at, you know, shifts from forestry into tourism, for example, in rural Maine and in the Northwest. I think there's only so many, you know, prisons that realistically can be built, and I think the communities, you know, for example, Eastern Colorado communities have kind of gotten a bit of a lifeline through them. Certainly moving east outside of the region, you know, the area around Wichita has access to industry, manufacturing. You know, once you get into eastern Nebraska, you've got, again, a more diverse economy. So I think the challenge is just you know, one of, there not really being any good options, maybe, but there being less bad options, if that makes sense.
Hi, Steve.
Hi.
Hi. My name is Ann. I work at Playa Lakes Joint Venture, and I was curious about, there's a couple of interesting tensions that you kind of mentioned that I wonder if you have any input, you know, if any of the landowners kind of discuss that in your interviews or whatever. But the one is, you know, the 5 landowners controlling 75% of the water, and, you know, how that kind of knowledge influenced kind of their attitudes in perception of being able to conserve the water meaningfully. And then also the producers and how they and the non-producers who have a stake in the groundwater management, and if there's any kind of resolution on how to make folks that don't pull groundwater, what is their responsibility in this water conservation area?
Sure. Well, so first, just to clarify, it's the 5 largest families. So it's not 5 individuals, it's 5 farming families. And, I think I'm not sure how well the structure of agriculture is, in terms of ownership, is really known by non-farming folks. I think I don't have an answer for you, but I will say that there's some indications that the Wichita County Water Conservation Area group is branching out and involving more non-producers in their work. And I know they worked with, I believe they worked with you guys to try to get a conservation grant, and unfortunately I don't know the outcome of that.
We got it.
Oh, good. Okay, great. So I think there is, and unfortunately, our research grant is over now, and I've graduated. But I think there is a real opportunity to look at exactly that, and is there going to be an opportunity to get more of the community involved in a way that's constructive rather than divisive?
Mm-hmm.
Stephen, this is Amy, and this is sort of a tangent, maybe a little bit off that question. You mentioned at the beginning and at the end this idea of the depletion of the groundwater being kind of decoupled or separate from, or there's like a need, basically there's an extraction going on, but it's not paired with a reinvestment that is directly into the producer's actions or behavior or ability to function. I guess I might be paraphrasing too far, but I guess I'm wondering from your conversations and in the material that you've pulled together through the surveys, if there are concrete ideas with regard to what kinds of reinvestment. You've talked about, that there's opportunities for flexibility with policymakers, and you've just touched on grant opportunities from the academic side to look at these things closely, which is a kind of reinvestment. But going back to producers, since producers indicate they don't know what to do, they don't necessarily know what all the best options are, did some ideas for certain kinds of reinvestment that could help come up in your work in talking with them?
Yeah, okay. So specifically what we found is at the county level, incomes, health metrics, and education outcomes are not influenced by the degree to it, by groundwater extraction. And so part of that is likely due to the treadmill of production that I mentioned, right? And, a lot of the value of agriculture, right, in terms of the value chain, it doesn't accrue back to the farmer or rancher. I mean, we know this. But the value that sort of has been returned to the communities is, it's less tangible. It's in terms of less tangible, but no less important, I would argue. It's being able to maintain a valued lifestyle and a valued community with people in it, right? So, as far as what can be done, I don't think it's realistic within the time frame we're talking about to change the structure of agriculture in the United States, right? I mean, there's very large forces at work in terms of how agriculture works. I think most producers recognize what's going on at some level. The whole idea that producers maybe get two cents out of every food dollar, things like that. As far as what can be done about it, it seems that the approach potentially that producers are trying to take in some areas involves, stretching the groundwater and trying to get those social and cultural benefits, make the water last long enough that those benefits can be gotten in other ways. And I think it's unclear whether that will ultimately be successful or not. But it is certainly something that I think is well worth the effort to try to make happen.
Hi, Stephen. This is Megan. Thanks for the really great talk. It's really insightful. And I think, what we've seen across your work in the project is that the value of this local level collaboration and policy. But I'm curious, from your interviews and perspective, to what extent did federal farm policy and RCS programs come into the picture in enabling conservation once there was this collective will put in place? And to what extent is that important to leverage moving forward?
Yeah, well, so federal farm policy, of course, has a huge impact on producers' decision making, right? One thing that we've seen in Kansas has been, since the Freedom to Farm Act in '96 that got rid of set-asides, we've really seen the edible dry bean acreage declining. And part of that, producers were telling me, part of that is because they would plant their edible dry beans on land that they were not able to plant grain commodities on. I think, as far as there were varying opinions on the partial irrigation crop insurance. I had some producers who really felt that was a great asset, that is now available to them, to be able to, irrigate less than full irrigation without losing their irrigated premiums. I did have other producers tell me that really they didn't think it really made sense for their operation, even with the changes that were made. So yeah, as far as, I think state level policy has a huge impact. And in Kansas, that's been pretty clear over the past decade. There's been a few things that Kansas has done, and I know each state, has policy, but I can really only primarily speak for Kansas in terms of interviews. Kansas got rid of the use it or lose it provision of water law, and that was a big deal. They provided a legal framework for local enhanced management areas and for water conservation areas, right, to actually provide legal support for voluntary groundwater conservation efforts. The Kansas Geological Survey is a source of information that is huge for producers to really understand what's going on in their areas. And that dates back to, I think, the 1970s. I know one of the former chief engineers is on the call, so I better be careful I get things right. But it dates back a while to basically a metering requirement that's been in place for 40 years or so. I think there's more that could be done at the state level in terms of policies. We have a water plan that we haven't been able to fully fund, and it looks like, given the current economic crisis we're facing as a country, that's not likely to be fully funded in the future anytime soon. But how do you support further support community efforts, right? And another thing, how do you make sure that people see your stick without you having to use it, right? There's the carrot and the stick idea, and the idea that the state might come in and regulate, even though by and large the state in Kansas hasn't, is certainly something that producers can and occasionally have turned to try to get other producers to get on board with some of these efforts. I feel like that doesn't really answer your question, Megan, but I think it's a really difficult question to answer, and especially as we're likely entering into another period of financial distress.
No, it's great. I think the description of the impact of the state policy was also really helpful. Thanks.
Are there any other questions? All right, well, hearing none, I'd just like to thank everybody again for coming and for your collaboration with this research, and hopefully we'll meet again. Amy, do you have any last words?
Just to say thank you very much for taking the time. And I think this is your last official day at Kansas State, is that correct?
Yes, I'll still be working on publications and things, but yes, this is the last day I'm being paid, so yeah.
Well, congratulations on finishing your GRA, and it was great opportunity to get to hear from you today, and thank you for fitting us in as one of your send-offs.
All right.
We really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Amy.